Greetings, everyone. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Welcome to this online edition of the OHC's regular Work in Progress Talks. Work in Progress Talks are presentations given by faculty and grad students who are current research fellows at the Oregon Humanities Center. If you have questions for our presenter at the end of the talk, please use the chat feature of Zoom. You can access that feature by hovering over the bottom of the Zoom window with your cursor. I will moderate and ask the questions. We've also enabled the closed captioning function of Zoom. You can activate captions by hovering over the live transcript option at the bottom of the Zoom window. The talk is also being recorded and will be available for viewing later today on the Oregon Humanities Center's website and YouTube channel. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to alert you to a special matching gift opportunity. Supporters can maximize the impact of their gifts to the OHC thanks to the generosity of Amanda and Alex Haugland, who have offered to match gifts to the OHC through December 31st, 2020. You can give at ohc.uoregon.edu/give, and we'll put that address in the chat box. I'm delighted now to introduce Elio Garcia, a PhD candidate in English and a 2020-2021 Oregon Humanities Center Dissertation Fellow. Elio's academic interests include cinema and media studies, environmental studies, post-colonial studies, indigenous studies, creative writing, and theater and performance. Today, Elio will give a work in progress talk based on his dissertation, The End of Modernity, Temporalities of Nation, Indigeneity, and the Anthropocene in the Contemporary Independent Cinema of the Philippines. Welcome, Elio. It's great to have you here.
Hello, Professor Pepis and everyone who are here. I would like to open my talk by saying thank you to the Oregon Humanities Center, headed by Professor Paul Pepis, to the amazing staff, faculty advisory board, and the fellows who make a wonderful community of scholars whose works make an impact in their respective fields. Thank you all for the work that you do. I cannot emphasize enough how this fellowship has helped me think and write more productively despite the challenging times. To all of you here for taking time to be in this talk, thank you. So my talk consists of two major parts. The first one is the introduction, which will lay down where I am coming from in my grappling with subalternity in its engagement with modernity via the nation, via its failed project that is the Philippine post-colonial nation state. The second part, titled The Long Take as the Nation Form in the Cinema of Love Diaz, functions as the baseline of my project as it examines the relationship of the long take as an aesthetic and political tool to critique the rigid and enclosing structure of the nation state and highlight the agency of subaltern subjects who persist in this enclosed system. I begin by underlining that the post-colonial nation state as a historical formation that hinges on modernity and capitalism is incomplete, failing, and broken. The nation is a self-fractured concept that is its inherent structural anomaly is its own definition. Probing on this self-fracture, I derive models based on incommensurable temporalities that reimagine the nation's structure through a body of independent films from the Philippines that represent the subaltern engagement and negotiation with the post-colonial nation state. Persistence, autonomy, fluidity, and transcendence, herein I call as auto-critiques of modernity. These models dismantle the nation's homogeneous temporality and expose its complicities with the neo-colonial and neoliberal regimes to democratize time. That is, to recognize the multiple temporalities of the indigenous outside dash within. The nation form, and the climate subalterns who become a historical subjects emerging out of the catastrophes caused by the Anthropocene. The teleology of colonialism and liberation struggle and the consequent birth of the nation state born out a trend of subjugation that is neocolonialism, where, according to Gramsci, physical force is no longer necessary. Hegemony, I quote, is established at a cultural, ideological, economic, and political level. Consent is arrived at without being freely given by subjects, that is, consent that is systematically extracted through techniques of governmentality. Tantamount to the failure of the nation state is its exclusionary and deracinating effects on the subaltern and indigenous communities whose cultural rhythms, worldview, and indigenous consciousness do not coincide with the modernist and capitalist tempo of the nation state, that desires for development even while its institutions are built on colonial legacies and are thus fundamentally broken. The subaltern in its engagement with modernity is not legible under the nation's developmentalist optics, or if the subaltern is otherwise legible, it is only by being a standing reserve waiting to be exploited and expended to realize the nation ambition, and as a farther moving margin of communities that needs to be folded in the national body that is yet to synchronize in the 21st century. The nation state as a project of modernity must be redefined based on its incompleteness, making incompleteness the blueprint of its structure, a decalcomania of modernity's incomplete arrival. That modernity should be in a state of constant failure to be able to create a surplus necessary for the accumulation of capital among the few, not the distribution of capital among the many. That modernity as an overarching narrative is not a singular temporality, but in reality a system of multiple temporalities gyrating like pinions that set modernity's clock into motion. These pinions auto-critique the modern nation state, the plural optics of times, which my dissertation proposes. Subalternity, indigeneity, and the Anthropocene are in themselves temporalities that the modern nation state cannot liquidate but must reconfigure to open better possibilities and strategies to enact equitable social and environmental justice. Modernity via the nation state is not a temporal singularity in the sense that it demands a constant dialectic to account for its systemic violence, examine and dismantle dominant histories to make way for simultaneous historical narratives that have been delegitimized because they do not serve those in power. Kyung Kim confronts the question of authoring history as a unified narrative of the nation which mutes other histories. Who is narrating it? Whose nation? What agency is there for the people to narrate history? Kim asserts that researchers need to see through the blunt walls of officially sanctioned narratives and identify the hidden multiple subjects and objects of national imagination. Nationalism as a meta narrative dwarfs the narratives of smaller others and sacrifices these narratives because there is a nation that must be unifiedly imagined. In its desire to arrive at the nation form, the nation, according to Prasenjit Duara, often lacks mechanisms to critique itself. Without these self critiques, it is easy to overlook the systemic abuse of the rights of oppressed classes predicated on their undervalued humanity or justifying their expendability for the sake of nation building. For Duara, and I quote, the nation is a historical configuration designed to include certain groups and exclude or marginalize others, often violently. As a relationship among constituents, the national self is defined at any point in time by the other historical others that have effected an often uneasy reconciliation among themselves and potential others that are beginning to form their differences. And it is these potential others that are most deserving of our attention because they reveal the principle that creates nations, the willing into existence of a nation which will choose to privilege its difference and obscure all of the cultural bonds that had tied it to its sociological kin. Paying attention to the smaller others corrects the prevailing nation imagination. The peripheries of the peripheries, as the last sites of contradictions and contestations, reveal the unsustainability of the desire for progress and hijack the center to relocate the discourse to the margins. Centrifugally, the periphery becomes the defining structure of the center, becomes the new center, for there is no center without its margins. Dipesh Chakrabarty refers to this autocritique as, I quote, a Derridean trace of something that cannot be enclosed, an element that constantly challenges from within capitals and commodities, and by implication, histories with capital H, claims to unity and universality. Subalternity is the limit of history and by implication of the nation state. This limitation, however, must be constantly imagined not in a spatial horizontal figuration, but as a formation within incirculations to emphasize the act of encompassing and yet not totally ingesting because of the incommensurability and multiplicity of temporalities in the within. To speak of the subaltern is to inevitably speak of capital that has reorganized spaces and populations within the nation state. The subaltern is the perpetual fracture and breach of the nation form and borrowing from Trinity Minha, the marginality that is the condition of the center. And yet, I do not insist on assimilation and integration because both efface and homogenize. The result of such mechanisms is exclusion. By insisting to stay on the outside within, the nation form is in perpetual shape-shifting aporia, where subjects create opening breathing spaces for themselves to end the long suffocation caused by the nation state's enclosure. By insisting on the polytemporality of the nation state, staying true to its simultaneous coming together of incoherences, modernity does not only constitute but is also constituted. Modernity does not merely enact its effects on the marginalized, but the marginalized engages and meets modernity's effects and in turn effects and defines modernity. The Filipino independent films that I read are reimaginations that contest prevailing ways in which the nation is apprehended, negotiated, and arrived at. For worlding does not only involve material or concrete realities, but also how collectives imagine or dream that world. That's Arjun Apadurai. With new imaginations come new possibilities, new legitimations of what counts as a sense of belonging, sharper critiques to governmentalities, that is, refusing to subscribe to abusive techniques of the nation state by first reorganizing one's imagination of and relation to it. By insisting on temporalities instead of spatialities and corporealities, the nation ceases being only locative or geopolitical, statistical, or sensual, which sets a rigid imposition of unitary national sovereignty but assumes a plurality, a dynamism, and becoming based on mobilities, negotiations, and processes enacted by the sovereignties of the other. That is, the trellis of the counter imagination of the nation is built from multiple subaltern temporalities instead of national geographical temporal bodily coordinates. The preceding four chapters revolve around a body of films by Lav Diaz and Brillante Mendoza, key independent contemporary filmmakers from the Philippines who have gained prominence in the world's major film festivals. Diaz and Mendoza are outsiders to the cultures that their films represent, and yet their visions of these cultures are effectively validated in the global film market through the important awards they have reaped over the years. An Orientalist mechanics that necessitates the examination of how they imagine the subaltern to interpolate the nation instead of the opposite, which consistently figure in the films. I observed that the nation comes as an absent given, interpolated by mere allusion, a sinister that is downplayed through a signifying practice, which, borrowing from Sangeeta Gopal, I call the national unconscious. So that's the introductory part. The first autocritique, persistence, exemplified in the chapter The Long Take as Nation Form in the Cinema of Lav Diaz, examines the long take not only as an aesthetic signature or method, but also Diaz's ideological position as a filmmaker of third cinema, in which I read the Diaz shot as a cell where the nation form is coded. By examining the triadic structure of space, time, and body in Mula sa Kung Ano Ang Noon, or From What Is Before, I present an anatomy of the shot as a unitary system of the environment or the physical universe of the shot, duration and progression of actions taking place within the cinematic universe, characters or laboring bodies in the state of bare life. I wish to illustrate in this chapter the sustained violence that a rigid nation state does to subaltern bodies, so I may be able to show the aporia in the chapters that proceed. An important theoretical contribution to spectatorship is my proposal of the term polytemporality in this chapter, which refers to the visibility of time that slow cinema is capable of enacting towards the spectator. Polytemporality reveals the spectator's body as a result of their consciousness of duration, which in turn enables critical spectatorship. Nagisa Ushima defines the shot as a unit that contains the filmmaker's method. The temperament of the filmmaker and the way they perceive reality can be derived from the study of their single shot. In a long take, the shot is more lucid and elaborate because the audience sees an uninterrupted consciousness of the filmmaker flowing in real time. The filmmakers and the audience's engagement are joined and most sustained in the long take necessary for a dialogic relationship to meaningfully exist. Diaz is a renowned filmmaker often read in the international film circuit in terms of style, and the resistant vein that gives his visions their trellis is set aside in recognizing the artistic merits of his films. A distinct departure from Western filmmakers' methods, the long take of Diaz as a deliberate resistance against the oppression of commercial cinema must be contextualized in relation to his habitus as a filmmaker and subject from the third world. Diaz vocally acknowledges the socio-historical consciousness replete in his films. Filmmaking is bound to serve a greater cause of social justice and must be rooted in the basic freedom to create. Gitino and Solanas articulate this ideological position as a revolutionary attitude of filmmakers born out of the long history of struggle against imperialism. The slowness of Diaz films challenges the dominant conditions of cinematic experience by putting attention economy into crisis. As new technologies provide new modes of spectatorship has become more individualized. The spectator, who is usually removed from traditional viewing sites, feels restless in the presence of a slow cinema that activates a heightened awareness of the experience. For Andrew Horton, the modern spectator who is experiencing a fragmentation of time in the digital age has acquired a broken sense of place and space, a displacement that occurs when exposed to unfamiliarly prolonged duration. The viewer becomes self conscious and directs their attention to the viewing process and the time such process takes up. The restlessness it could cause is symptomatic of the anxieties regarding time in an age of capitalist modernity. Asbjorn Gronstad writes that, I quote, what the extreme long take visualizes is the passing of time itself. This visualization sustains a crucial moment of inabsorption, a rupture in the cinematic experience that makes slow cinema reflexive. The spectator enters the sphere of a polytemporal cinematic experience as opposed to a unitary linear temporality caused by mainstream conditioning with homogeneous time. This time matrix, which I call polytemporality, creates a textured experience of time on the body by not allowing it to drift. Rather, polytemporality marks the spectator's body, making it visible to itself. Thus, slow cinema, by visualizing time, visualizes the spectator's body and maps that body within a network of times. The network of times is translatably the network of looking, which is also a network of power relations. Trinity Minha analyzes this act of looking too long as a surrender of power. The image, and I quote, the image that speaks and speaks volumes for what it is not supposed to say. The pensive image is one that does not facilitate consumption and challenges the mainstream film in its most basic assumptions. This network of looking bodies, bodies on screen, spectators' bodies, the film as a body, is what mainstream cinema effaces, wherein the spectator gets caught in verisimilitude, gets immersed in entertainment, and suspends the act of questioning. For good films, in popular opinion, are supposed to make the body forget about the passing of time, not become conscious of it, by recording only a significant happening and excising dead time, or else the spectator thinks watching is a waste of time or money, since homogeneous time is measured against productive human labor. This theory on the form of mainstream cinema, Jonathan Beller argues, is one developed by capital. And I quote, though the meanings of cinema are found in language, its significance is in the symbolic known as capital. In principle, all of the possibilities, affects, and experience available in the cinema are capable of being symbolized as capital. In other words, converted to exchange value at some earlier or later stage of social production. As media function as belts that create organizing connections within the post-industrial society, the consciousness is also co-extensively structured with this organization by, and I quote, introjecting industrial process directly into the mindscape, and thus is born the cinematic mode of production. Beller refines this theorization, arguing that, and I quote, cinema and its succeeding, if still simultaneous formations, particularly television, video, computers, and internet, are deterritorialized factories in which spectators work, that is, in which we perform value productive labor. It is in and through the cinematic image and its legacy, the gossamer imaginary arising out of a matrix of socio-psycho-material relations, that we make our lives. Not only do the denizens of capital labor maintain ourselves as image, we labor in the image. The image which pervades all appearing is the mise-en-scène of the new work. What the visualization of time reveals is the hidden labor of spectators, of bodies both as capital and units of labor pre and post figured in the image making in mainstream cinema. But because Diaz's cinema provides no entertainment, the spectator's body is marked and made naked, forming the network of laboring bodies and making the cinematic experience an experience of total conscious labor. With the commodification of time, the working clock does not stop ticking even when spectators think they are spending their free time watching. The time spent is in fact an extension of work, is work, and looking means perfecting the industry of visuality, a web from which there is little escape, if any. For to forget time is to forget labor, to visualize time is to visualize labor. Labor that is not only projected on screen, but also enacted by and thus projected on the spectator's body. This is how the body becomes the ultimate news screen in the era of visuality. The body is a crux of time, the basic unit of labor and consumption, one which renders our lives in a perpetual parallax, captured in a dizzying installation of gossamers. DSC's long take, an organization based on a resistant other logic, powerfully reorganizes a capitalist world and reverses capital shock in the audience's mindscape through an alternative worlding and experience of time. It places the attention economy into crisis. So allow me to share with you some screenshots from the film from what is before, so I may illustrate that the cinema of Diaz exhibits space-time body integrity achieved most profoundly in his archetypal shot. So that's Love Diaz with some of his notable films. He's very much known for making very long films. To date, his longest is more than 10 hours, and that's Evolution of a Filipino Family. These films are very much well recognized and awarded in international film festivals. What will follow are photos of some of the characters in Mula sa Kung Ano Ang Noon that will illustrate the formula that I'm trying to explore in his films. Right. So the Diaz shot is an extreme wide angle long shot sustained in a long take in which the physical environment is a hostile space where human bodies arduously move. Forces of nature are engulfing and are images of historic destruction, as May Ingawanij observes. A scene usually begins empty and the spectator has to wait for a figure moving into it, tiny and approaching from a far distance until the figure goes out of the frame. The time the figure takes to walk in and out of the frame is the actual duration of the shot. This creates a sharp but ambivalent relation with the spectator's body experiencing the discomfort of extreme duration coevally in the presence of exhausted bodies. Diaz uses dead time to build up patterns of movements of characters to establish the rhythm of life of the Filipino subaltern as post-colonial subjects. In the cinema of Diaz, landscape and environment do not function as mere literal spaces. Diaz treats space as the milieu of characters before he looks for a pre-filmic geographic template. In his frames, the empty landscape is filled with the presence of a vision of a universe which the characters later inhabit. With the extremely difficult one frame method and the long take, the audience notices the idiosyncrasy of that universe. Once the human characters emerge or enter the frame, the established universe forms a relationship with the characters. The environment is not subordinate to characters, but plays as an actor in a Diaz film. The body, broken by laboring in time and spanning wide spaces, functions in the Diaz shot as the ultimate bearer of duration. Diaz's characters suffer by performing unproductive labor that directly distorts or deforms the human body. The characters are capable of sustaining the struggle to live, but waste physical exertion because it promises no resolution and in turn waste the audience's time by performing extreme durations with their bodies. However, confining the reading of the character's physical movements as unproductive is failing to recognize what Marx calls as real labor. In the interpretation of Chakrabarti, to include difference of temporalities in the sense that what is real includes humans and non-humans, which are the raw materials that are made abstract, that is, abstracted from their source and transformed to become universally legible through its consumable form, which is the commodity. And I quote, the transition from real to abstract is thus also a question of transition slash translation from many and possibly incommensurable temporalities to the homogeneous time of abstract labor, the transition from non-history to history. Real labor, the category itself is universal, must nevertheless have the capacity to refer to that which cannot be enclosed by the sign commodity, even though what remains unenclosed constantly inheres in the sign itself. In other words, by thinking of the commodity itself as constituted by a permanent tension between real and abstract labor, a memory into this analytical category and what lies on its outside, something that it can never completely capture. The outside is constitutive of the category, the gap between real and abstract labor, and the force constantly needed to close it is what then introduces the movement of difference into the very constitution of the commodity and thereby eternally defers its achievement of its true slash ideal character. Following the logic of this unenclosable gap between real and abstract labor and applying it to both labors of characters and audience, the experience in Diaz's cinema plays out the juxtaposition and therefore translation of the temporalities of the subaltern vis-a-vis the hegemonic audience. What is visualized and experienced, the time that unmasks labor is perpetual difference. This, I propose, is the core energy of how the cinema of Diaz is a critique of the nation form. It dismantles the interworking of capital by revealing the temporalities that are otherwise erased and muted and reinscribes it in the viewing process. Labor in Mula is only unproductive because whatever labor they do, it always amounts to nothing because the systemic structure does not allow life in this universe to flourish. The failure of the people is not autochthonous in their bodies, but is a result of the violence of the new colonial structure that must first dehumanize the subaltern prior to their ingestion. The nation state in its capitalist tempo that plugs it into the world system is the sovereign that decides who must be killed. The subaltern body must first enter the state of bare life, a stage when human lives are transformed into expendable so they can expire along with the natural resources and ecosystems that are made to conform in the accelerated and unsustainable pace of capitalist consumption. Diaz formulates the nation form by mapping a small barrio that is geopolitically isolated by forests, seas, underdevelopment. The rain, treated by the people as an evil omen, is persistent in the narrative and present in almost all frames in the film. The large ocean waves that hit the dark and rugged rocks are relentlessly violent. The ground is always muddy. The forest is enchanted. Where the cattle die when they enter, the mountains are not mists or mere outlines, but always distinct and brooding, even when they are far. In a span of 338 minutes, the spectator witnesses how this barrio decays from being cut off from the government's promise of progress. The elementary school lacks classrooms, which students do not often attend. There is no high school, no hospital, no concrete roads, and the main bridge unfinished. Established as a periphery, the government decides to send the military forces to camp in the barrio due to a suspicion that the insurgents have taken refuge in its mountains. This leads to the people abandoning the once quiet and peaceful place, receiving the state's iron hand instead of benevolence to improve their quality of life. The barrio is a microcosm of many peripheral spaces in the archipelago that failed to modernize during the Marcos regime, while Manila, as a monument of the regime's ambition to flaunt a hollow symbol of the nation's modernity, was being concretized as a metropolis out of excessive loans from World Bank and the IMF, the majority of funds siphoned by the Marcoses' coffers in offshore banks. The barrio as a space where negative modernity is experienced is exemplified in a scene where Heading, the military who spied the village for 2 years, reports to her superior, and they both listen to Marcos's declaration of martial law. Off screen is either the television or radio where the voice of Marcos, interrupted by occasional noise of interference, is heard. The invisibility and uncertainty of technology that represents modernity evokes a negative absence, which suggests that the barrio is an out of bounds site of progress whose transmission is heightened by the lack of clarity in the form of signal interference. Diaz shots this barrio always in extreme long shot and uses depth instead of editing, composing with strong awareness of foreground, middle ground, and background through orchestrating characters to move across three planes. When the characters exhibit pain or anger or despair, Diaz does not zero in on their faces, but maintains the physiognomy of the landscape. The spectator sees the characters from afar and feels the intensity of their emotion through the dark sky, the rain, the storm, the crashing waves, the howling wind, the swaying trees, the fluttering leaves, the silence. Instead of a human face for a close up, the face of space, the face of the universe. Diaz never removes the people from context. Landscape dwarfs them without pity. The barrio as a closed system is shot progressively as a summation of the spaces travailed by its people. Subordinate to space, time plays out in Mula as the story starts in Media's rest, and the performance of the present is an uncoiling of what has taken place in the past. Itang, the older sister of mentally challenged Joselina, is already downtrodden by years of taking care of her younger sister who could not walk, talk, and take care of herself. Their neighbor and father figure, Sito, has grown old in his inner loneliness. His adopted boy Hakub has been consumed by a strong sense of longing for parents he never saw. The barrio where they live and where their lives are contained is now in the state of exhaustion from years of government neglect. Duration enables the spectator to witness the minutiae of their lives. Time is what it takes for old Sito to plant or harvest rice in the field, or wait for a dove that wouldn't show when he hunts in the forest, for Itang to start and finish her Ave Maria or scrub the floor or clean Joselina's excrement all over her body or move through a long distance carrying Joselina on her shoulder to the sacred rock by the shore where they hope for a miracle. For Jacob, who acts as an errand boy to neighbors in the barrio, crossing one house to the next, walking long distances barefoot and shivering under the rain. The seemingly unproductiveness in the way time is expended by these characters transforms into a rhythmic pattern of life as a ritual of poverty, illness, and death the longer the spectator immerses in the world of this barrio. The social consequence of a major historical trauma that is the Marcos regime, preconditioned by the long, uninterrupted succession of colonialism by the Spaniards, Americans, and Japanese. While the end of colonialism is a book ending in history, the post-colonial subjects do not always emerge anew. Post-coloniality is a mere relationship to time in the same way that pre-coloniality is a mere relationship to time, only that the latter does not rest well with teleology, for what is pre-colonial technically resists history, it is outside of it. In Mula, the bodies of characters are deformed by illness and unproductive constant labor. Joselina, as a village healer, is herself mentally and physically challenged. Itang, while strong and able-bodied, has low and rounded shoulders. Sito stoops with old age and limps when he walks. Jacob, while young, looks frail and small. Diaz emphasizes how these bodies perform under each burden in many moments. Jacob, tiny in the frame, carries a large bunch of bananas on his back. Itang hangs the heavy Joselina on her shoulder. Old Babu and military spy heading balance merchandise on their head. The winemaker carries large jars of wine on his back while moving to and fro. Sito performs all sorts of backbreaking work despite his aching body. The audience witnesses how the characters strive to sustain the weight in long periods of time, starting out like dots in the horizon, moving to the foreground in the frame until they need to rest so they may be able to continue the labor. The labor is cyclical, a kind which offers no progress, a wait out, a mere passing of time, or of lives that are past desiring. To say that the subaltern bodies moving in the space-time of the Diaz shot are exhausted simply because of labor is an optics that misses their agency. Labor is not the means to their destruction, but the end result of their will to persist within an oppressive system. All characters except Jacob live in the state of melancholia, in a strong sense of loss and trauma, where desire is silenced if not lost altogether to many years of subjection. Akub, on the other hand, steals a map from the elementary school and traces the faraway island and the sea he is determined to cross to see his parents, a desire founded on a kinder truth told by Sito. Because when Jacob was just a baby, Sito found him bathed by his mother's blood in the forest. The mother has just been killed by the father, and the father is about to kill the baby Jacob. Sito kills the father, saves Jacob, and makes Jacob believe his parents had to leave because, as lepers, they had to be isolated in an island leprosario. Jacob, poring and sleeping over the map, invokes an imagination of a nation, an obvious nod to Anderson that is more desirable than his claustrophobic barrio. Diaz inscribes in the child the possibility or a futurity where one can find a way out of the system towards a temporality and spatiality, the completion of his family that does not exist. At the end of the film, the subaltern bodies disperse by physically leaving the unlivable barrio in search for peace, or in Itang's case, by ending her life in search for liberation, her final act of resisting the nation state's liquidation of her and her sister's body, and thus reclaiming her agency as a sovereign subject. The representation of Diaz, though self-orientalizing, provides a systemic vision and deep context of the third world situation. The Diaz shot critiques the rigidity of a post-colonial society that aggressively homogenizes peoples and cultures and liquidates further the disenfranchised. Bare life is not an ontological essence in their character, nor a statement of Diaz's denial of their agency, but a result of that agency within systemic failure. The subaltern body persists in an enclosed system that suffocates. Diaz renders a different imagining of the nation, constructing it from below and worlding a space-time that annihilates its filmic subjects so that its out-of-screen subjects may begin annihilating that world. his films show history's vicious cyclicality from which there is no beginning or end, where there is no escape, where traumas by fission and fusion give birth to new traumas, as his shot is not only a cell which originates life, but also a person that engulfs that life and assures its destruction. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elio, for that fascinating presentation. I also want to thank you for getting up at 4 a.m. to give this presentation as you are currently in the Philippines. And that I also want to let people know why we keep hearing the rooster crow, because it's the beginning of the dawn.
Right.
So let me encourage our viewers to share their questions for Elio in the chat, and I'll share them with him. And while we're waiting for those questions to come, oh, good, Sergio has quickly given us one, so I will share it with you. Could you tell us more about the independent in the contemporary independent cinema of the Philippines that you are focusing on? Sergio is asking this first because he assumes that that in the Philippines this category functions differently from the way it does in the U.S. And second, because in the cinemas of Europe and the Mediterranean, the context that Sergio knows best, this category is virtually useless, both institutionally and aesthetically. He says he's asking, in effect, about the relationship between the body of films you are looking at and the categories of art cinema and festival cinema, which you seem to have rejected. That's how Sergio would normally understand the films of Mendoza and Diaz.
So the body of contemporary films that I'm studying in the Philippines basically are not seen in public spaces. When I say public spaces, this is in the commercial venues, like movie houses, for example. They are oftentimes self-funded and also through specific grants, sometimes from the government, but very meager resources. So in terms of content between mainstream and independent films in the Philippines, we see a kind of polarization of the kind of themes and stories that they tell. So basically, the socially significant ones, those that educate, those that instruct, those that provide more awareness, can be found in the independent films, while the mainstream cinemas are trapped in rom-coms, love stories and melodrama and all that. However, the crucial thing about this body of independent films is that because they go through the international circuit of film festivals, they are the ones that kind of represent more um, certain narratives to the international audience, not the mainstream cinema. So there's a kind of wall that happens in the home ground, and then the representation is different in terms of the outside. So we don't often portray, the rich ones, for example, in the independent films. It's always very much socially socially aware. If that answers the question.
Here's another question. Can you say something about the audiences for these films and their reception, their critical reception, both in the Philippines and outside of the Philippines?
Well, it seems like so in my personal research, for example, being in certain venues where these films are being shown, um, one time we made like a kind of local organizing to bring the filmmaker and pay more for the venue and something like that. So these events are attended by cinephiles and students who are, some of them are forced to watch the film by their teachers. The productive venues that these films can be seen are through um, local festivals in the country, which happen in partnership with educational institutions. And of course, the Cinemalaya in Manila. Um, there's a government wing like the Development Council of the Philippines and all that. But in terms of like really popular access, we don't see much of these films.
Is there a sense that the complex ideological critique that you're describing is perceived by the government that is in part the focus of the critique? Uh, that is to say, do government funding sources or government agencies, do they perceive the critique that you're outlining, or does the technique of the film uh, ensure that they will not watch the films to perceive their um, criticism, the criticism that the films?
Right now, I'm more inclined to believe more on the second possibility that you are asking, because who would sit for 10 hours just to be able to understand the critique or look for critique, especially government at that. So um, at least those who are working in the culture and arts are aware. The scholars are aware. The film teachers are aware. But as for the government, in fact, they look at Love Diaz as a feather in the hat, someone who bags awards for the Philippines and all that. But as to the awareness really of what's inside these films, that it's actually a critique to the nation state and all that, the techniques of government. Um, I'm not sure they're into that.
Next question. A wonderful presentation. This is from Stephen Rust. Since you brought up Marx, Stephen's curious to take you back to Sergei Eisenstein's theories of montage editing and its revolutionary potential. We all know that his techniques have been woven into commercial cinema and that he spent the latter part of his life essentially a prisoner of the Soviet state. Um, so the question is, when it comes to the long take, what's different? Is it the historical context, the fact that commercial cinema still generally avoids the long take?
That's a very wonderful question, considering that Love Diaz admires very much Eisenstein, but vocally says that, but I'm not gonna go where his techniques are. Um, and 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 Steve Ross is right about how the montage technique has been very much used in commercial cinema. How his films would become also very much instructional for filmmakers later on. But Diaz says, no, I'm not going to use the montage. And as to the question is that of whether it is based on historical context, yes, that is true, and also really as a deliberate resistance to commercial cinema. Diaz initially started with mainstream industry, but he didn't like how it was run. He didn't like the working conditions, and he didn't have much liberty to be able to pursue his main technique. On the cultural level, Diaz theorizes that this slow movement of bodies, all this waiting, all this long duration, um, is informed by the pre-colonial biorhythm of the Malay culture, wherein people are more attuned to nature and space around them rather than time. In fact, he theorizes that sometimes I think about it as procrastinating, but it's not. He says, like, we waited too long to revolt against the Spaniards. We waited for 21 years to overthrow the dictatorship of Marcos. So there's this kind of waiting, which is linked to the pre-colonial condition of the Malays.
That's fascinating. The next question is from Daniel Steinhardt, and he asks, if you think Diaz's approach to the long take has changed over time, especially as he's made shorter films. If so, does his exploration of temporality, the body, landscape, and the other issues that you've analyzed also changed over time?
The thing is, his 2019 and 2020 film I haven't watched. right? But based on the reviews, um, there is a significant departure from the single camera and the long take method. Um, in fact, he made a musical, the the Time of the Monsters, I think, which is only about like 2 hours plus. So there is a significant departure. I think also partly because there is a criticism. I forgot who. It was a European film critic who said that after after the Batang West Side film, um, all his films have already been trapped within that formula. So that the long take method has been like an artistic trap for Diaz. So in his recent films, which are much shorter, this kind of there's a kind of departure that took place. However, I sense the same preoccupation about the subaltern condition that is consistent in his films. It still flows, even though there are the risk really about asserting a filmmaker's particular method is that there are always exceptions and that it will be false at some point.
So now I'm going to share a comment from Sangeeta Gopal. It's not a question, it's just a comment, but I want to share it with you. So Sangeeta says, it's very interesting to think about Diaz, whether he's watched widely or not, as a certain type of post-colonial intellectual who uses the cinema itself to think through the political categories of post-coloniality. So it's interesting to think about cinema as a temporality of belatedness. Wow. That's her comment.
Thank you,
Any
Sangeeta.
comment on her comment?
Um, Sangeeta and I have been in conversations over the years, and I owe so much my theorization, in fact, of DS as very much an anthropology. So that comes from her. So thank you, Sangeeta, for that kindness.
So I have a follow-up to your response to Daniel Steinhardt's question. You pointed out that one of the critiques that came about Diaz's films, about the long take in particular, was that it had become a kind of aesthetic trap for him. And you suggested that in his more recent films, he sort of moved away from the long take and his films are much shorter. And I'm curious about that because in your theorization, in your account, the use of the long take is ultimately is a mode of um, liberation. I mean, it's a mode of activating the agency of the subaltern. Is it not? It is.
It is.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So that's an interesting irony to think that a technique that he theorizes as having a kind of political a capacity to politically activate becomes a kind of aesthetic trap for him.
Yes, that's a very fascinating comment, really. Um, Recently, there was a news that came out that Diaz is going to be funded by multiple sources of funds, and that will also the anticipation is that it will also compromise style, distribution, and viewership. So I'm a bit nervous about that. I should finish this dissertation before that comes out, or else it will be very much dated by then. Yes.
Excellent plan. Um, can you say a little bit about how you came to this project? I mean, I think this is for a number of reasons. I think it's clear that this is a filmmaker that Western audiences are probably not that familiar with. Can you say something about how you came to be fascinated by his filmmaking and the larger dissertation project overall?
Mhm. I think my fascination to his film was a natural direction from my fascination, really, of the kind of life that I saw around me in my childhood. Love Diaz and I come from the same island in Mindanao in southern Philippines, and watching his films really is like just rehearsing the visions, that I had in the past. So bringing in the kind of preoccupation, those big questions about why is life this way? You know, when I watch the movies, for example, when I consume a lot of American visual products, it's like, oh, it's really different. It started as a kind of fascination. In fact, um, there was a time when I couldn't understand Diaz. I understood the images, but I did not understand the method. So that kind of inquiry, I think, led me to that direction. In my master's thesis, I studied Brillante Mendoza first because I was like, okay, if I get a PhD, I will go to Lab Diaz because it's like more difficult. So that's the kind of trajectory that I had, and also I think part of the larger journey that led me to this dissertation is the studying in the United States, you know, coming from the province, like the periphery, very far from from Manila, and then jumping, going to the United States, where I am able to see things from geographical and psychical distance, and learn theories from the West as well that inform. So it's a constant negotiation between what my body knows as an archive, um, and also the theories that I read.
Let me again encourage the audience, since we're coming to the end of our time, if anybody has any other questions, to share them. I want you to say a little bit more about your faith in the revolutionary political power of aesthetics. Obviously, I'm the director of the Humanities Center, so anyone who makes such an argument, it's of interest to me. What gives you faith that radical aesthetics, revolutionary aesthetics, can have a revolutionary political force?
Uh, First and foremost, I am a teacher before I am a scholar. So I'm in my 11th year of teaching, and I've always saw that literature and film are very powerful tools in, you know, changing or expanding the way students see the world. It's always been an enjoyable discovery every time that happens, when you see the spark in students' eyes. Um, Being able to serve as a conduit, not necessarily to make them believe what I believe, but perhaps introduce to them a different way of looking, a different way of thinking about our lives, for example. Um, in that sense, how film bridges life in the house, in the church, in the street, in the market, in the forest, in the farm. They see the connection of this visual product, and that it can illuminate certain questions the way it illuminated my own questions way back. So I have very much faith in that. I don't think that will ever waver.
Well, Elio, we've come to the end of our time. I'm going to thank you on behalf of our audience, and I'm also going to read a comment from Kirby Brown, which is a comment. I think it's a nice closing comment. Kirby says, this is really exciting and sophisticated work and presentation, Elio. Congratulations on the fellowship and on the work you're doing to bring this important archive of cinematic work to the broader attention. I'd like to second Kirby's congratulations, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all. Thank you, Kirby.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining us for Elio Garcia's Work in Progress talk. For more information about the Oregon Humanities Center and our upcoming sponsored events, or if you'd like to contribute to supporting our research and public programs, go to ohc.uoregon.edu, and we'll see you next time.